welcome to our final event of our spring series talks. Today we have a guest speaker from Florida State University, Professor Nilay Özok-Gündoğan. She will be presenting on the Kurdish nobility in the Ottoman Empire, loyalty, autonomy, and privilege. I will briefly summarize Mamoste Nilay Özok-Gündoğan's biography and what she has been doing, what's her expertise in. And then we'll move on to lecture. I will leave the floor to her to present for about 40 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session for about 15 to 20 minutes. And during Q&A session, you can ask your questions either in the chat or you can click on the raise button if you want to take the mic and ask your question. That's going to be the program today. So Professor Nilay Özok-Gündoğan, if I'm saying it correctly, Nilay Özok-Gündoğan is an associate professor of Ottoman and Middle East history at Florida State University. Her research centers on the questions of modern state-making, property regimes, and intercommunal conflict and coexistence in the borderlands of modern empires. She also writes about the question of methodology in Kurdish studies. Her publications appeared in Journal of Social History, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and Middle East, New Perspectives on Turkey, and in edited volumes. She also contributes to Jadaliye with op-eds on the Kurdish studies. Professor Nilay's first manuscript, The Kurdish Nobility in the Ottoman Empire, Loyalty, Autonomy, and Privilege, was published in Edinburgh University in 2022. Has received the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association's 2023 Book Prize. Her current manuscript, Forging Empire, Mineral Extraction, State-Making, and Colonization of Ottoman Kurdistan between 1720 and 1870, examines Ottoman colonization of Kurdistan through the study of mineral extraction at the Kaban and Ergani mining region in the 18th century. I'm hoping I was able to capture all the best work she has been working on, and I congratulate her for the book prize that she recently earned in 2022. I'm not going to take too much time here, and I'm just going to leave the floor to Professor Nilay for her talk, and we will move on to Q&A after she has done. So no questions or interruption during her talk as much as possible. Thank you all. Professor Nilay, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much for this generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I think one of the beauties of our profession is I get to see, like, I don't know, 25 people who are interested in hearing about things that I genuinely am interested in. It's really a big luxury in the modern world. So thank you for inviting me. I hope I can maintain your attention for the next 40 minutes. And I am really interested in hearing your thoughts and questions. Now, let me share my screen with you. And okay. I think it is working, right?
Yes.
So this talk is based on my book that you just mentioned. And I will try to animate this narrative with a couple of vignettes. And then I will also try to talk a little bit about the research that I did and the theoretical framework that I used to talk about the Kurdish elites in the Ottoman Empire. So let's open up with this fairly long vignette to see where we are going. Soon after, Kethuda Bey appeared at the door. "It is the Hakim of Palu, Cemşit Bey," he called out. Cemşit Bey looked to be in his 50s. He was very tall and had a dark complexion. He was wearing an Abani turban and an embroidered cardigan. There was an empty scabbard for a dagger on his belt wrapped around his waist. His dagger was taken before he entered. It was forbidden to appear before the Sultan with a weapon. Cemşit Bey was one of the Kurdish beys who declared their loyalty to the Sultan during the Chaldiran battle, where he distinguished himself and showed significant achievements. He put in an effort and had a share in victory. Cemşit Bey stopped 3 feet from the throne. He put his hand on his chest and greeted the Sultan. The Sultan responded, "Aleyküm asselam, Cemşit Bey. It makes us pleased to see you among us. How are our brethren along the borderlines? I represent the Sunni Kurdish Beys in your presence. They chose me from among themselves. They asked me to convey their loyalty." He took out a kozak from his belt and passed it to the Sultan. "Here is the deed of alliance. It is sealed by 25 Kurdish Beys." Sultan Selim opened the kozak, took the paper out, and read it carefully. Kurdish Beys were proclaiming their unconditional acceptance of the sublime and just rule of the Ottomans. There were 25 seals on the bottom of the page. The Sultan's face lightened up. He said, "Thanks, God bless you all. We are appointing these beys, whose names appear here as the emirs of the places where they are situated. Praise be." Cemşit Bey reached out to Sultan to kiss his hand. Yavuz stood up hastily, grabbed Cemşit Bey from his shoulders, and pulled him towards himself. "We like hugging our brethren, brother Cemşit." Cemşit Bey was to the Polu nobility what Osman Gazi was to Ottomans. A ruler of the Polu Emirate within the Ottoman realm, Cemşit Beg's ancestors, the Mirdasi Begs, predated Ottoman rule in the area. According to Şeref Han's Şerefname, arguably the most comprehensive historical account of the Kurdish noble families, Mirdasi Begs led an emirate centered on neighboring Eil around the 11th century. The Polu Emirate was established by one branch of this family based in the Bağlan Castle near Polu. When his uncle died without an heir, Cemşit Bey became the leader of the emirate and brought it under Ottoman suzerainty in the early 16th century. You see, the scene I quoted is from Mısır'a Doğru, Seferi Hümayun, a novel that came out in 2010 by Yavuz Bahadıroğlu, a novelist and columnist known for his Islamist conservative bent in Turkey. The last volume of a trilogy narrating Sultan Selim I's reign, the book covers his eastern campaigns. Bahadıroğlu's dramatic description of Cemşit Beg's encounter with the Sultan obviously employs several leaps of imagination. It would be difficult to know what Cemşit Beg actually wore, how he comported himself, or the Sultan's exact words. But two things in this scene are true. Well, I can attest to that as someone who works on this particular family. Cemşit Beg did have an audience with Sultan Selim I in Karaman when he was on his way to Tebriz. And as the scene implies, Cemşit Beg's military achievements during the Ottoman-Safavid Wars of the 1510s made him stand out among the Kurdish Begs. He defended the Polu fortress from the Safavid forces and was one of the Kurdish Begs who accepted Ottoman suzerainty as a result of the diplomacy of the Ottoman envoy Idrisi Bitlisi. This made Cemşit Beg the architect of the Polu Begs' incorporation into the Ottoman Kurdish nobility in the 16th century as a noble family with a hereditary privileged status in the Ottoman world. His descendants maintained their hereditary rule over Polu until the mid-19th century, for 3.5 centuries. Şerefname includes a story about Cemşit Beg from before he ruled the Polu Emirate, when he served Halid Beg of the Pazuki Emirate, another Kurdish emirate. As this story goes, Cemşit Beg, who was known as Kara Cemşit at the time, was hunting with his master, and Halid Beg's bird soared high, staying in the sky longer than usual. When it finally came back, it landed on Cemşit Beg's head, which witnesses understood to mean that he would someday have a magnificent state. A few days later, Cemşit Beg's uncle, the emirate's ruler, died without an heir, and Cemşit Beg succeeded him. This is the foundation myth of the Polu Emirate under the charismatic leadership of Cemşit Beg, reminiscent of the Ottoman Empire's foundation myth under Osman Gazi. You know, some of you might be familiar with the Osman's tree and the founding myth. Cemşit Beg did not lead a world empire that lasted 6 centuries, but he proved his leadership and diplomatic skills in the context of the Ottoman Safavid Wars, and he solidified the rule of his noble family, who maintained their hereditary rights for the next 3 centuries. Now, I told you before I would be animating this with a few vignettes. I would like to fast forward to 1848 now, to a village of Palu named Weshen. You see Palu here on the map. In the last days of August 1848, the inhabitants of Weshen, which is a village of Palu, nestled in a secluded valley on the banks of the eastern Euphrates, woke early. The men met at the village mosque to perform the pre-sunrise prayer, marking the beginning of Eid. Just before the prayer began, they heard the sound of distant gunfire. As the noise approached, the prayer goers saw that it was being made by Abdullah Beg, the Hakim, or the ruler of the Palu Emirate, and at least 600 armed men. They were coming to collect 1.5 tons of clarified butter from the villagers in payment for 4 years of back taxes owed to Abdullah Beg. The villagers responded by opening fire. It turned bloody, and with 3 villagers dead and 4 wounded. The despairing villagers then fled to the surrounding hills. The next day, Abdullah Beg came back with his men and set the village on fire, burning 65 houses and the buildings to the ground, along with stored grain, animals, and their fodder, poplar trees, and vineyards. And I actually have the entire inventory of all the damage that took place on that, unfortunate day. On the surface, this event seems like just one among many conflicts about agrarian surplus extraction the world over. For us, however, it is important because Abdullah Bey was a descendant of Cemşit Bey, and Weshen was under his hereditary control. But what neither Abdullah Beg nor the villagers knew was that the incident would trigger a series of events that would break up the Palu Beg's hereditary rule in the Ottoman Empire. Within a year, this violent encounter would cost Abdullah Beg his position as the Hakim, his land holdings, and when the Ottoman state exiled him to Tekfir, today's Tekirdağ, in Rumelia, 900 miles away from the lands that his ancestors had ruled for centuries, his bond with his homeland. And with the end of Abdullah Beg's career came the end of the Palu Beg's hereditary rule. And this is the contemporary view of Weshen, currently a nahiye or a sub-district in the state of Turkey. Kurdish Emirates and the elite families have been the cornerstones of both popular and academic historical renditions of the Kurds and Kurdistan. The audience here probably are very familiar with those histories. But although the Emirates feature in popular notions of Kurdish history, they are barely addressed in actual historical research. The scant existing scholarship has focused on the most powerful Kurdish ruling houses, namely the Baban, based in Süleymaniye, Botan, based in Cizre, and Soran in Rwandus. All 3 disappeared from the political arena in the second half of the 19th century as a result of the Ottoman military campaigns. In the 19th century, Palu Emirate was geographically smaller and politically less significant than the previously mentioned emirates. Often I get this question, why do you work on Palu but not one of these more important emirates? The Palu Begs did not respond to the Ottoman state's mid-19th century centralization policies with large-scale uprisings. We know this historical narrative, reconquest of Kurdistan by the Ottoman state in the mid-19th century, but the story unfolded in a kind of like a different way for the Palu Emirate. It is true that Abdullah Beg, like the rulers of 3 formidable emirates, was exiled by the Ottoman imperial state around the same time period. But the rest of the family stayed in their historic homeland and continued to claim rulership of the emirate for several decades after Abdullah Beg's exile. Thus, the Palu Beg's modern history does not fit with the nationalist and teleological interpretations of the Kurdish past, in which the Kurdish ruling families represent heroic resistance to the Ottoman state's military and political encroachments during the long 19th century, because, we kind of almost always talk about Kurdish nationalism in a linear way. It starts in the mid-19th century and we bring it all the way to the present. But the story of the Palu Begs show us something different, something that does not quite fit with teleological historical narratives. let's animate this a little bit more and fast forward to 2013. On a hot summer day in 2013, I visited Palu in search of the descendants of the Palu Begs. My initial inquiry led me to a young man. Dressed in a suit, he pointed out of the window and said that he owned the quarry by the hill, Taş Ocağı. His voice could not hide his pride. This was one of several references to his wealth. He was proud of his connection to the Begs, but they were totally fabricated. When I was listening to him, since I probably know more than any member of their family about their history, I noticed some discrepancies, but it is quite common because oral histories, you don't listen to them for the facts, but you are interested in the narrative itself. But he was proud of his connection to the Begs, but they were totally fabricated, as I said. The actual descendants of the Begs, a retired teacher in his mid-50s, very sweet person, came to meet me in his decrepit Renault 12, probably from the early 1990s. He seemed happy to have the attention of an historian interested in his ancestors, and mentioned that the quarry owner was a Nuwarish, whose desire for a noble past led him to the Palu Begs. In Palu, a small district that is now an slightly impoverished backwater, the title of Beg had survived into the 21st century. The Beg's wealth, however, had not. I found it puzzling that the title persisted when its bearers had long since fallen from grace, that it was potent enough that a well-to-do person would claim it. The Beg's real descendants could prove their noble identity via a temlikname, which is a title deed from the Ottoman sultans that recognized their hereditary rulership over the Palu Emirate, which they kept in a chest in their attic. And I'm grateful to the descendants of the Palu Begs for sharing those documents with me. From the day they acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty until after the empire's disintegration, the Palu Begs maintained their identity as a noble family, the belief that they, as nobles, stood above other men. The sense of a noble past predated the Ottoman suzerainty, but the Begs justified their noble privileges by referring to the imperial decrees granted by the Ottoman sultans. The content and the extent of their privileges changed over time, but until the frontal attack of the Tanzimat state, mid-19th century reform program of the Ottoman Empire, the hereditary character of the Palu Begs' privileges remained unchanged. My book presents a comprehensive account of the transformation and eventual disappearance of the Kurdish noble families' hereditary privileges in the Ottoman Empire. By examining the noble position of the Palu Begs, my book challenges one of the foundational assumptions of Ottoman historical writing. Ultimately, I'm an Ottoman historian, so the established narratives in Ottoman historiography is something that I feel like I can work with, deal with, and try to challenge through the story of Kurdish nobility. This foundational assumption of Ottoman historical writing that the Ottoman state categorically rejected the hereditary nobility. According to this view, I will try to explain this established notion in Ottoman historiography to you now. Unlike Europe, the Ottoman political administrative system was inherently inimical to hereditary nobilities. According to this narrative, the system was meritocratic, the ruling elites were the slaves of the sultan, and there was no way of transferring property across generations since the Ottoman state confiscated property. So these established notions like the devşirme system establishing the slave, like the Ottoman kul system, or the müsaadere, the confiscation of property, all of these were mentioned to make a point about Ottoman states really being not open to having hereditary noble families. Underlying these views is a set of assumptions about the absoluteness of the Ottoman state's authority. Recently, revisionist approaches to the Ottoman state have demonstrated the flexibility of Ottoman ruling strategies, and they demystified the notion of the all-powerful Ottoman state. Nevertheless, the argument that hereditary nobility was absent stems from the continuing impact of ahistorical and essentialized views of Ottoman state power that has origins in European political thought. From the Renaissance thinkers to Weber, European observers and thinkers emphasized the meritocratic system and the patrimonial character of Ottoman rule. So this is what I problematize. Why do we see Ottoman state power as absolute, and where does that idea come from? Eurocentric accounts of the Ottoman state reproduced these notions and treated the Ottoman Empire and Europe as dichotomous, highlighting what the former lacked compared to the latter. In its essence, this argument is based on the belief that there was one type of nobility in Europe, uniform across time and space with no historical variations. As you would imagine, and I'm an historian and I am literally allergic to meta-narratives, so that's what I'm trying to point out here. For Ottoman historians, the French nobility is usually the prototype of European nobility. So what it means here is that when they say there was no nobility in the Ottoman Empire, they are referring to French nobility as the ideal type. But it's not just the Ottomans. Most comparative studies of nobility are defined by a research agenda derived from French history. Based on an entrenched estate system constituting a corporate body and with hereditary rights that monarch could not seize, the French model was considered the ideal and thus the basis for comparisons and conclusions about the Ottoman case. But what if the mirror image of Ottoman nobility discussions, that is European nobility, was instead a kaleidoscopic reality? Maybe it was not an ideal type that they assumed for a long time. Revisionist approaches within various strands of European historiography have presented a more nuanced and historicized portrait instead of the long prevalent ideal type definition of nobility. So this is a little bit conceptual and theoretical, but I want you to keep in mind our bags, polo bags, when you pay attention to this conceptual discussion here. The single term nobility, as one scholar states, quote, should comprehend a spectrum of people which stretched from the leaders of small communities of several hundred people to an elite group of families which dominated a single county to a supra-regional elite. So its size varies. Unlike the French model, not all noble groups were legally defined as an estate by the monarch. Nobility not only had regional variations, there are urban-rural divisions, power and wealth differentials, variations in manners and etiquette. All of this make it impossible to discuss nobility as a uniform category. And the nobility's political power varied across place and time. Not all nobles in or out of Europe were represented in a representative body. But if the nobility is an elite, which was open, imperfectly defined, and subject to regional variation, as one historian says, one might legitimately ask what nobility actually entails if it is that, heterogeneous, if it is that varied. Despite the variations, there are patterns that allow us to deploy the concept to understand certain elite groups. Originating in a pre-capitalist socioeconomic milieu, nobility at its most basic entails entitlement or preemptive claims on resources by virtue of one's own distinguished position. So at its essence, nobles believe that they have a distinguished position, and that's most of the time, that point is endorsed by a monarch. The historians Leonard and Whelan state that the notion of distinctiveness that nobility entails goes beyond mere inequality with its dominantly legal and socioeconomic connotations. Furthermore, nobility must be acknowledged by both external and internal groups, meaning for the poly-elites to be recognized as a noble group, it doesn't just sufficient for them to have the self-identification. They also needed to be confirmed by an outside power as well. So now I'm going to talk about two more key terms here. Nobilities are formed as a result of the coalescence of service with privilege, okay? İmtiyaz in Ottoman. As far as service is concerned, in return for performing services and fulfilling duties, nobilities are assigned hereditary rights, privileges, and prerogatives. In addition to honor and lineage, military valor constituted one condition of noble identity. Above and beyond their military functions and entitlements to landed wealth, the making of the nobility also involved a process of ideological construction that allowed them to justify their status and wealth by virtue of descent from noble ancestors. And this construction was fortified through a special code of conduct used only with other nobility and the ruler. I mean, now think about all the narratives about how different Kurdish begs interact with each other, the etiquette that they establish, the conduct that they use. So there is also the concept of honor and the use of honorific titles that differentiated them from others. Often, I mean, I'm going to just intervene here and kind of interrupt the flow. People often think that I work on the tribes because, like, from an outsider's point of view, Kurdish society constituted, a coherent monolithic entity, and it consists of the tribes. But tribes, what tribe is, it's not the same thing as an emirate, or begs are different from tribal chiefs. So these nuances are important. For all of these that I mentioned might be relevant to tribal chiefs as well, but it is definitely the case for the leaders of the Kurdish emirates. So as for noble privilege, it refers to the rights granted to a specific group based on hereditary descent from a venerable ancestor. Privilege, one historian states, is European nobility's only indispensable characteristic. This is really the key. We can't think of nobility without privilege. Even though their wealth, political power, degree of authority varied according to region and context, there was no such thing as nobles without privilege. Noble privileges included rights in political, juridical, fiscal, and social realms. And I will actually elaborate on this a little bit more, referring to my specific noble group. I conceptualize the noble position of the Kurdish begs, specifically the Palu begs, within this framework of hereditary nobility defined by privilege and service. So the question now is, where does the nobility of the Palu begs come from? Sorry, all these concepts, I know they're not the most fun stuff to go over, but I believe that they will help us understand where the notion of privilege comes from when we discuss the history of the Kurdish elites. The 16th century encounter between the Kurdish ruling houses and the Ottoman envoy Idris Bitlisi was formative in the defining of the Kurdish begs as a noble group within the Ottoman administrative system. Remember the opening vignette in which Cemşit Beg had an audience with Sultan Selim I. During his Eastern campaign, Sultan Selim I tried to gain the support of the Kurdish ruling elites of the area. Idris Bitlisi, familiar to the audience here, a seasoned scribe in the Ottoman court, was tasked with persuading the Kurdish emirs to side with the Ottomans against the Safavids. He was provided, this is also mentioned quite frequently in the literature, with blank imperial orders, and the specific name for that is a temestükname, with the Sultan's seal on them. The content of these temestüknames would be defined as a result of Idris Bitlisi's diplomacy, and it would shape the terms of the Kurdish rulers' incorporation into the Ottoman realm and define their privilege. Idris Bitlisi's skills as the envoy proved critical in this regard. Of course, much of this account comes from his own writing or the heroic narratives about his role. So there is a little bit of exaggeration, but there is one thing that I really want to emphasize here. Not only he was familiar with the region, but he also understood the sociopolitical organization of Kurdish leadership and the way their noble lineage allowed them to claim the right to rule over these territories. His familiarity with Kurdistan and its noble families convinced him that recognizing the Kurdish begs' hereditary claims to leadership was essential to securing their loyalty. Besides, the Sultan himself specifically asked Idris Bitlisi to pay the utmost attention to the hierarchies between the Kurdish begs while designing the administrative structure of Ottoman Kurdistan and granting these titles to them, to the begs. So Bitlisi started from the conviction that the Kurdish begs had a legitimate right to rule over their territories, a rule accepted by the region's previous ruling dynasties from the Selçukids to Tamerlane. It was within this context that noble privileges of the Kurdish begs were granted within a special administrative position as hükümet, literally the government. I really need to underline this. In the 16th century, when this arrangement was made, hükümet was not really the term that was used, but the entire configuration that they came up with rendered Ottoman autonomy as a specific political administrative unit in the Ottoman system. What separated the hükümets from the ordinary Ottoman sancaks was that they were designated as Mefruzul Kalem, you see on the screen, and Makduyul Kadem in the administrative system. The first one, Mefruzul Kalem, referred to the hükümet's immunity from having timars, fiefs granted to the cavalrymen by the state in return for military service. So the Kurdish Emirates, they didn't have timars. Of course, there are exceptions because it doesn't mean that Ottomans did not try to do it. So you will see that there are occasions, some of the emirates, you might witness the existence of the timar, but it wasn't the rule, so it was against the regulations. This also meant that Palu, along with other Kurdish hükümets, were spared from tahrirs. Tahrirs are the surveys, right? Once a new region was annexed, these detailed surveys were conducted and the data was recorded in detailed registers. The second one here, Makduyul Kadem, refers to the fact that Ottoman administrators, whether it's military or civilian, were barred from having any authority in the emirate, mainly the tax collectors, but also others, such as the Janissary troops or others. The Begs held their own private forces, and it's usually they stand on top of like a tribal confederation. So tribal forces constitute their military power. And they seize the agrarian surplus from the areas under their dominions. Now, we often talk about this in survey-like accounts of Kurdish history, but it is really important. When we talk about Ottoman conquest of places, these two institutions are of key significance, the Tahrirs and the Timars. Kurdistan did become Ottoman in this context, but with a special sociopolitical organization within the context of the hükümet. So the earliest written document establishing the Palubegs as a privileged noble group in the Ottoman realm is from 1535. Granted during the reign of the Sultan Süleyman I on the basis of the original document that his father, Sultan Selim I, granted to the Kurdish Begs. The privileges decreed by the Sultan reflected the imperial state's recognition of the Begs' existing authority over these territories. The document is quite explicit about this. The aforementioned Begs of Kurdistan had held and possessed these territories and the castles from the times immemorial, which had been their yurts and ocaks. The Temlikname further stated that Kurdistan Begs, aforementioned castles and territories, for territory, the word that they use in this one is ülke, that they inherited from their ancestors in their control. Again, I'm grateful to the descendants of the Palubegs for sharing this with me. This is only one piece of a much longer document. In the Temlikname or Temestükname, both words are used, the bearers of the privilege of hereditary rule were defined as the Begs of Kurdistan. This is of key significance. It indicates the imperial state's perception of them as a collective entity. Another indication of this comes through the way the question of appointment is discussed in the Temlikname. The document explicitly highlights the hereditary character of rulership. In the absence of a legitimate heir, that is a male descendant, the new ruler would be chosen by the consultation and consensus of all the Kurdistan Begs. This is also very important. So the Ottoman state not only acknowledged the Kurdish Begs as a corporate group entitled to specific immunities and prerogatives, but it also accepted their authority to decide on their ruler through their collective decision-making process, and established that the Ottoman state would not bring in someone from outside that collective. Overall, the Palubegs' privilege stood atop two pillars. The first was economic, which is really ignored quite a bit in the literature, like the economic source of their power. And it concerned the proprietary rights of the Begs over the land and its surplus. The second concerned their political administrative authority over a delimited territory. The Temlikname is explicit about both. I'm quoting from this document. Handing him this Mülkname, I decree that henceforth the said eyalet with designated boundaries and explained borders would be his property, his mülk. So another aspect of the nobility is the significance of genealogies for them. To speak of nobility, Mark Bloch wrote, is to speak of pedigrees. The way to justify hereditary rights over landed wealth in times of economic distress, or to protect existing fiscal or political privileges vis-a-vis a potentially hostile monarch, was often genealogy. The Palubegs had a consciousness of their noble identity and had a conspicuous interest in their pedigrees. So you see, this is one pedigree or genealogy that they have in their possession. And this is a more recent genealogy of the Palubegs that they shared both versions with me. And actually, I also found some mistakes in the genealogy in either of them here, because I can follow the entire family through Ottoman documents. From the 16th until the mid-19th century, the rulership of the Palu Emirate or Hakim came from the descendants of the Palubegs by virtue of the imperial documents granted to them in the 16th century. And this document was renewed by successive Ottoman sultans at least 4 times. For the Palubegs, this noble consciousness and its accompanying sense of entitlement showed a striking continuity from the time they came under Ottoman suzerainty to the end of the empire. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because in Kurdish historiography, we take administrative divisions for granted, and we think that divisions on the paper or how things appear on paper reflect things happening in practice on the ground in reality, which is really not the case. This is only how things are seen officially from the perspective of the Ottoman state and from the perspective of this noble group. In order to understand how this relationship functions on the ground, we have to look at actual circumstances, actual interactions between the two. In the book, I examine the transformation of the actual content of the noble privilege and the resultant changes in the degree of the autonomy that the Kurdish begs had from the 16th through the 19th century. I really have to emphasize this, because what we have here is a definition of autonomy. So Maktul Kadem and these two terminology indicates the framework of autonomy. This is how the autonomy of Kurdistan and Kurdish Emirates were defined. But in reality, there are several other dynamics that don't really show that clearly on paper. I look at various realms, including military service, administrative structures, and mining, as areas that affected the content of the privilege and service over the course of the 3 centuries of Kurdish nobility's position in the Ottoman Empire. From the 16th until the 18th century, the Kurdish nobility was tied to the Ottoman imperial realm mainly through military service. After Cemşit Beg died, the begs were frequently summoned to Ottoman campaigns in Iran and elsewhere, and as far away as Algeria or to Basra. They complied at times and resisted or deserted at other times. The initial military role the begs performed diminished progressively after the 17th century, together with their military power. So this document was written by an Ottoman scribe in 1633. And this document actually talks about the changing military functions and the decreased military contribution of the Kurdish begs during the Ottoman military campaigns. He says, during the earlier Persian campaigns, the Kurdish commanders were like raging lions and wild tigers, with the ability to recruit 50,000 to 60,000 soldiers. In the most recent campaigns, however, they commanded forces as small as 600 or 700. So, Aziz Efendi, he suggests that the Sultan try to revitalize the noble and respectable position of the Kurdish begs through appropriate etiquette and decorum. He wanted the Sultan to issue decrees that recounted the noble service the begs provided to the crown, by virtue of which they deserved to be treated with respect and care. Essentially, he was advising the Ottoman Sultan to maintain the noble privileges granted to the begs during the prior reigns and protect the hereditary succession of the Kurdish nobility, so that the imperial state could once again put to use the sharpest swords the swiftest and most active Arabian horses, and the most valiant and blood-shedding Kurdish warriors, accomplishing even greater services than in the past. The Kurdish nobility, however, was really becoming less and less reluctant to provide military service. And this has a couple of dynamics. And for different elite groups, we might talk about different factors here. But for the Palu nobility, and actually surrounding begs, this is also the case, the major reason that the begs refused to serve in the army or in the military campaigns was because they were put under another burden in the 18th century, which is actually the subject of my second book, the Keban-Ergani mines. So this important mining area basically connected the Kurdish noble families to a specific mining administration, which forced them to provide the basic necessities of mines. And in the 18th century, the basic necessity primarily consists of fuel. So this elite group that we have been talking about, the Palu begs, and their noble position is now changing, not because of the Ottoman state's primarily aggressive policy or anything like that, but because of the political economy of mining. And the Kurdish nobles essentially provide for the basic needs of the mines. But this does not happen in a very neutral context, because this newly emerging position of mine superintendent basically challenges the noble privileges of the Palu begs. So that's why what I'm saying here is we can't just look at the paper, because if we look at the paper, we will see that the noble position of the begs are still there, it's intact. But when we look more closely into the actual interactions between the noble begs and the Ottoman state, there is so many questions, so many problems happening, because the begs were under a big burden of providing for the mines. By the way, I'm not talking about any mines here. The Keban-Ergani mines are literally the main engine of the Ottoman war-making machinery in the 18th century. And in the 18th century, Ottomans are fighting wars on 3 fronts, with the Habsburgs, with Russia, and against Iran. And for all of these wars, the basic copper that the Ottomans use come from Ergani. So the Ottomans really have to rely on these mines for their war-making. And for silver from Keban is the basic source of metals that they used in the Ottoman mint, darphane. So the service that the Kurdish nobility provided is of crucial significance, okay? But that is also the reason why the Ottoman state is becoming more interested in kind of incorporating the Kurdish nobles into the mine administration. So I'm gonna talk for a few more minutes here and then sum up. So this, up until this point, from the 16th century through the 18th century, even though things have been changing on the ground, one thing is not changing, which is the noble position of the begs. The Ottoman state, up until the mid-19th century, has no intention or interest to change the agreement that was defined in the 16th century, which granted the Kurdish nobles their privileged position. But this Tanzimat context is when things started to change. Remember the second vignette that I talked about when the Weshan incident happens. Once Abdullah Beg was exiled by the Ottoman state in the mid-19th century to Tekfirdağı, the Ottoman state for the first time takes a drastic step and confiscates the lands of the Kurdish begs. And this is not a neutral process. This is a part of like a larger scheme of incorporating Kurdistan into the administrative scheme of the Ottoman state. But let me emphasize one question here. Around the same time period, many of you are familiar with the Bedirhan Begs uprising and the large military operation that the Ottoman state, organized and conquered or reconquered Kurdistan. Now, when I read the documents about the Palu Begs and Palu nobility and how the Ottoman state tried to change the system there, I don't see a very ambitious Ottoman state. What I'm seeing here is an Ottoman state that is more hesitant. Even though the Palu family was not that powerful in the 19th century, they were in no position to resist. They were not anything like Bedirhan Beg or other big Kurdish emirates to challenge the grand scheme of the Ottoman state. But still, the Ottoman imperial state was very hesitant. And that, in the book, I argue, comes from a notion of legitimacy. So the Kurdish Beks consistently referred back to the 16th century agreement, but the Ottoman state was also hesitant to break that original agreement and violate the norms of it, because this is a matter of legitimacy. Every time the Ottoman state attempted to confiscate the lands of the Beks referred to the Temestukname. I showed you a piece of it. And that was a question of legitimacy for the Ottoman state. How do they deal with the imperial legacy without really damaging it? How can they benefit from the economic resources of Kurdistan? And how can they suppress the power of the Kurdish elites? So the story actually, up to this point, consists only of maybe the 30% of the book. In the remaining parts of the book, I talk about the complexities that emerge after the confiscation of the Beks property, because now we have a new group of people, like the Armenian population of Palu, who start to purchase lands from the confiscated property of the Palu emirs. Next week, in another talk, I will be talking about the 1895 massacres in Palu, and I will circle back to this point about how the confiscation of the Kurdish Beks lands resulted or triggered a violent process in Palu in the late 19th century. But for the moment, I think it is sufficient, because we really established how nobility was formed in the Ottoman Empire and how it changed over time. And thank you. 40 minutes is a long time period, and I appreciate the comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Nilay, for this wonderful presentation. Now it's time for a Q&A session. Please, if you want to take the mic and ask your question, please be brief in your question, of course. But you can raise your hand using the button down below, or you can simply just please type your question in the chat, and I'll read the question to the audience and the Professor Nilay to respond.
I have a question.
Zalfa?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Can you see me?
My
camera is not working. That's okay.
Let me see my speaker view, because yeah, I'm in gallery. Okay.
Can you see me now? Anyway, thank you so much for this presentation. Since you're interested in the nobility during the 16th century, and you mentioned Sultan Selim, I'm wondering if you're interested in also bringing forward to the public at large nowadays what happened to the nobility after the Treaty of Lausanne, 1922-1923.
This is an interesting.
I mean, do you have a continuum from the 16th century until the ups and downs of the Kurdish nobility? And I, as a Kurdish person, I always wonder what happened to the nobility. Mm-hmm. Nobody talks about the Kurdish nobility after the Treaty of Lausanne.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This is a very interesting question. It kind of, speaks to my several aspects of my current interests, because we have been, doing stuff related to Lausanne as well, conferences, talks, and all. But I understand where the question comes from. But by the 1920s or, 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, nobility was not a concept that resembled to what we meant by nobility in the 16th century. So when we talk about nobility, we conceptualize it within primarily an imperial context, right? Because it takes place in a pre-modern, pre-capitalist political, administrative, and economic context. Coming to the 1920s, and even today, of course, there are families who claim descent from these Kurdish noble families. But this is nothing beyond, you know, and memory anymore, because the system entirely changed now. If I had time, I would have told you how specifically, for instance, in Palu, even though like the claim to nobility persisted, it is now being replaced by the mid-19th century by a modern provincial organization. And in that modern provincial organization, the begs are now becoming müdürs or district governors. They are now becoming kaymakams, or they are becoming, you know, other a part of the Ottoman political civilian administrative system. So coming to the 1920s, the claim existed for sure for different noble families, but it had no resonance because the system now changed, and the making of the modern state really moved forward from the mid-19th century through the late 19th and early 20th century, that it has no resonance with respect to a political entity anymore, if that makes sense. So, you know, the larger discussion of Lausanne, of course, has a lot of implications for understanding Kurdish history, that it does not have, you know, it did not include the Kurdish delegation. It basically rendered Kurdish autonomy you know, useless, and it gave all the neighboring states the right to existence, and it was the end of Kurdish self-determination. And there is also really good literature on how Kurdish elite families engaged with the Turkish state, with the British and others, but nobility was not a factor in either of them because the system does not recognize them as such anymore.
But what happened to the records? What happened to the documents, the records, the interaction, the legal interaction between the Kurdish nobility and the Ottoman Empire? What happened to the record? Where is it? Nobody brings it forward. Nobody talks about it.
So with, sorry, I just need a clarification. I have a clarification question. By documents, do you mean generally archival sources about Kurds, or are you referring to the specific document which granted recognition to the Kurdish noble begs? Because this is important. This is an important difference.
In fact, about also the families that dealt with, where is the record? I mean, nobody talks about noble families among the Kurds, because Kurds are stereotyped in the public psyche as nomads, as people who are roaming the land. They are like, they are shepherds, you know?
Yes.
This is the stereotypical image, but nobody talks about nobility, and we don't have access to the record. Where are the records about the Kurdish nobility?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I also problematize that meta-narrative, because when we talk about Kurdishness, we talk about a stereotypical subjectivity, and I agree with you on that. But the documents are not, they are accessible. I mean, the Ottoman archives have thousands of documents about the Kurdish elite families. So it is like when you do archival work, we don't always look for like one specific document, like a title deed or a ferman that recognizes them. In my case, it exists, and it was not in the Ottoman archives, but it was in the possession of the descendants of the specific noble family that I am looking at. So, and then there are actually historians who do similar work to find, you know, local sources and dig in the Ottoman archival sources to see these types of documents. We have Vural Genç and others who bring these documents. But in the Ottoman archival sources too, Ottomans liked record keeping, let me tell you that. And they had a very, of course, they're an imperial machinery, and they had a very specific language, a very specific bureaucratic conduct that they used. And the Ottoman archival sources are full of documents that indicate the state's recognition of the Kurdish elite families as noble groups. It doesn't always have to be like the specific document that I showed you, but the way they address them. For instance, the Ottoman state always addressed them as begs. Let me give you an example here, a very fun example, because when I think the year is around 1918 or 1919, there is like elections to the first Ottoman parliament, and there are two people who are running for the MP, and they both have the same name, but one is beg, the other one is effendi. Titles are really important in imperial bureaucracy. And the voters, they don't specify. I mean, they vote for both, but then both of them claim to be the elected MP. But the Ottoman administrators refer to the fact that beg only applies to the Kurdish noble families. So I told you this story just to make this point about Ottoman sources, after careful reading, are full of documents to challenge the stereotypical narrative that you mentioned. It just takes a lot of time and effort. But then also we will need to talk to the Kurdish elite families if they are willing to share these documents. Thankfully, the Polo nobles, grateful to them, they share these documents with me. Others might also have these documents, and we just have to look for them. Yeah.
So really, there is no Kurdish archive. There is no Kurdish archive of the nobility among the Kurdish people.
No, because archive, I mean, they can be private archives, but when we talk about the archives, archive is a product of a state context. You know, archives are institutionalized and they are structured and cataloged mostly in state context. Kurds are a stateless group, so I don't know what is happening in Bashur in terms of the archival situation. But the Ottoman Empire sources about Kurdistan are primarily based in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul right now.
Don't you think, Doctor, that when we are basing our conclusions on the narratives and the factual record of the oppressor or the colonizer or the imperializer, we are repeating this narrative and we're not revising it, because in the absence of the Kurdish archive, in the absence of the Kurdish records, even if we are not acknowledging the narrative, the oral narrative of the Kurdish families, the nobility Kurdish families, if we are not acknowledging their oral history as contradictory to the factual archives of the Ottomans, then how do we locate the truth? Where is the truth? How can we judge that the oppressed, the victim, is not truthful, but we give credibility to the aggressor or to the oppressor?
Sorry, it's just like I'm thinking and it comes across as I'm interrupting you, but it's really not the case. This is an interesting conversation because I'm particularly interested in the question of methodology. So I can respond to that in two ways. One, what you're bringing up is not a methodological fallacy that is unique to Kurds or Kurdish studies. Historical research is based on triangulation of like different sources and trying to see what is happening or what types of different narratives come about the same historical event. So it is nothing unique to Kurds, but in the Kurdish case, you're right. I mean, we have to rely a lot more on oral accounts. And I don't know, maybe because I talked about this particular gentleman who was claiming to be from the noble begs and he was not, maybe I gave you the impression that I found his account less reliable. To the contrary, I find the oral accounts really important because that was what indicated to me that the Kurdish, I mean, the noble identity, the title of the beg, still found resonance in Palu. And now this means that I'm not trying to find a fact here, but narrative itself, how they construct that particular narrative about the Kurdish history says something. Meaning, even though noble status has no relevance in our contemporary era, there are people who think that it means something. So, but then the first part of the question, it is nothing unique to the Kurds. It is like a general methodological problem that historians have to deal with. And we have methods here. We use methods to make sure that we don't think that state's account is more reliable than any other historical subject.
Thank you very much for your answer, but I am not a historian and I'm not criticizing your methodology in any way, but in the light, I am an intellectual. In the light of the feminist criticism that is present right now in the 21st century, I mean, the whole criticism is based on a revisionist reading of all the literature that's there, whether it's narrative, whether it is oral, whether it is factual. So I'm wondering, when it comes to Kurdish history and Kurdish presence and Kurdish representations, why don't we really give credibility in a revisionist criticism of the oppressive history against the Kurdish people, the same way we did with the feminist movement? We applied this.
No, I didn't take
consideration the oral narrative of women. Until today, we do that. So even with the movement of Me Too that went on in the past year or so. So why don't we give credibility to the oral history as a primary source, and we create a certain method in really bringing voices to the Kurdish presence right now in the 21st century?
Okay, I can actually answer this question in so many different ways, and I didn't take it as a critic, and even if I did, it would have been okay. Don't worry about it. But the question here is, I am specifically critical of this narrative that oral history is the best way to understand Kurds, because I don't know if you realize this also feeds into this idea that Kurds did not leave any written records. They were a tribal group. They don't have any relationship with established imperial entities, so we have to rely on oral. So this discourse itself, it is a colonial discourse in the case of Kurds. Of course, I'm familiar with like this methodological issue when it comes to like the women's voices, other suppressed groups who might or might not leave written records. All really understood well. But when it comes to the Kurds, that becomes another tool to make this point that they didn't even leave any records, right? So they did not have any relationship with the established settled structures. They were just like a pastoralist. They didn't have written accounts, so we have to rely on oral accounts. This is not true. I actually wrote a couple of times about this specific thing. When we think of the Ottoman archive, that is, I see that as a space to be decolonized. Yes, it's a state archive, but a state archive has to be decolonized to unearth all these sources, all these voices that remain outside of the state's hegemonic narrative. So, I mean, I understand the sensitivity that you're putting on the table, but I don't think methodologically you're in the right place, because oral history narrative is literally a part of the discourse, making the point that they didn't even have any political structures. They didn't have any recognition. They didn't have any identity. So we have to rely on oral accounts. Oral accounts are important, but if we avoid written accounts produced by multiple imperial and national states, be it the Ottomans or the Safavids or the later mandate regimes, then we are basically saying that the world was changing, but the Kurds were not being involved with these changes. They were just like literally in the mountains doing their own thing. No, they were a part of the Ottoman-Safavid relations. They were a part of the World War I changes. How can we ignore these written accounts? It is just a methodological question. Whose voice do we want to prioritize here? And obviously, we don't want to prioritize, or we don't want to attribute truth claims to the power, to the hegemon, to the colonizer. But I really would like to emphasize this. In the case of Kurds, we can't just say that they have oral accounts and they are more reliable. This is kind of different from where the genealogy of discussion comes in relation to the feminist discourses. But in the case of Kurds, this touches upon a slightly different subjective position.
Didn't we do that?
Professor Nilay and Zalfa, I would like to kind of intervene. I really appreciate, and I am enjoying the mini discussion here, but there are a lot of raised hands, and I see Mohammed Mücahit Bilici also wanted to ask a question. So in order to be just, I will leave some time for them as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Zalfa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nilay, for this mini discussion here. Thank you. Okay, Mohammed Mücahit Bilici, did you want to ask your question? I know
sure, I'll be quick. I raised my hand. I think I was the first to raise. So thank you for the great talk, and sorry for my voice. I'm recovering from a cold. And so in the beginning of your talk, you framed your argument as a kind of challenge to the Ottoman historiography in terms of the assumption that Ottomans were hostile to hereditary nobility. Is your argument a kind of a Kurdish exception to this Ottoman position, or are you saying that Ottomans had were not fitting such assumption even in other places as well? Is it a Kurdish specific argument, or is it a broader Ottoman argument? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this is also a good question because I try to kind of operate in multiple realms, Kurdish history and Ottoman history, and then their contemporary ramifications of these histories. And it is yes and no. I mean, this maybe will not make sense to you, but this is how I formulate this. Because in the established literature, there is the idea that nobility did not exist. Ottomans were very powerful, all-powerful, that they dealt with it, right? But this narrative itself mostly comes from the Ottoman experience of conquest in the early centuries, specifically 13th and 14th centuries, which is from the Balkans and from the Anatolian geography, so to speak. So the narrative itself does not have any resonance with the Ottoman policy of conquest in the East, specifically in Kurdistan. So there's like a fallacy here in terms of the origins of the debate, right? But the second thing is, of course, there's like this Orientalist paradigm that I pointed out, that Ottomans were different. We refer to Machiavelli and his account. So I'm dealing with that part as well. Kurds were exception, but also not an exception. They're exception because they have a specific type of recognition that was granted to them in a particular time period in a specific context. But the formula that I gave you, mefruzul kalem, maqtul kadem, this is not unique to Kurds, okay? This Ottomans use this in specific context. So this notion itself comes from an idea that empires operated like nation states. Empires consist of different modalities of power and different modalities of autonomy. So from that point of view, there was nothing exceptional about Kurdistan, right? Okay, Crimea, that was also, they had also hereditary nobility. Wallachia, like Hijaz. All of these are various modalities of autonomy within the larger imperial system. What gives Kurds the uniqueness here is, one, the specific formulation of autonomy that took place in a specific historical context. And the second thing is the continuity here, right? The continuity of that recognition of nobility and its hereditary character for 3.5 centuries. That's what gives its uniqueness to it. But the uniqueness does not come from its genealogy per se. It comes from the process. It comes from how history unfolds. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Nilay. Kani Hulam in the chat, he's asking, in one of your maps, you have circles under the settlements like Palu,
yes,
Kulp, Mayafarkin. Some of the circles were darkened. The others were empty circles. Why is the difference?
Yes, because hold on, let me just, I'm actually looking at the map here to make sure that, because you write a book and then you forget what you wrote in this book. So I just want to be accurate here. We actually, with the person who nicely made this map, we decided on one thing. How do you see the bold in there? Because I don't see it in the published book here. But okay, let me see the point out the discrepancy here. We tried to separate hükümet sancaks from yurtluk ocaklık sancaks. So I don't know if Palu appears as bold in my PowerPoint, but I don't want to share it with you. So the group of Palu, I mean, that it resembles with the others, these are hükümet sancaks as recognized with this particular form of autonomy. But there is also another group, which is yurtluk ocaklık, that is also a particular type of configuration of autonomy, but it is different because yurtluk ocaklık sancaks does not have the hükümet status. So that difference comes from that. And there's another question in the chat.
Thank you. And before chat, I wanted to give a mic to Öner Yiğit for his question. He has been both Öner and then Rezan. They have been waiting for a while now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Nilay Özok-Gündoğan. So I'm not a historian, and my question may be very like a general and a person who does not much about history. But so you talk about noble families versus tribe or tribal leaders. So what differences and similarities stands out between nobles and tribe leaders? And like, do you think that Ottoman sultans' relationship with the tribe leader follow a different logic than its relations with noble families or noble leaders? So how do you do that comparison?
Yeah, this is a good question. Thank you. So one thing that I emphasize, this is like a preliminary caution here that I have to really highlight. When we talk about Kurdistan, we attribute a coherence to it, of course, right? Because it's like a historic geography and there are certain shared characteristics. But within Kurdistan, in terms of the specifics of political organization, in terms of the ways in which these particular units interacted with the Ottoman Imperial Center, there are a lot of differences. So I'm always hesitant to generalize from one case to the entirety of Kurdistan, okay? So keeping that in mind, let's specifically talk about the Palu case, right? In Palu, and there are other examples. I mean, there are other cases that their history is also similar to Palu. The base or the hakims, okay, that noble family is literally the conduit, right? From around the 16th century through the 18th century, Ottoman state interacts with the tribes through the hakim itself, because he is the recognized. So it is kind of like tribal elites or tribal leadership, even though they are kind of like within the Ottoman realm, the actual ways in which Ottomans interact with the region would be through the hakim itself. So there, I see it as a, what is it? Is that a pyramid? Yeah, this is a pyramid. The hakim would be at the top of this pyramid, while the tribal leaders constitute the armed groups that are joining the beg, the hakim, during the times of military campaign. So, but then Ottomans, that's why they thought that their closest equal in correspondence, their closest equal in terms of conversation would be the hakim, not the tribal chief. So if you look at the kind of like the muhimmes and the farmans from the 16th, 17th centuries, you will see that it is almost without exception, the Ottomans address the hakim, whatever the question is, if that makes sense. So from the point of view of the Ottoman state, hakims are the legitimate representatives of the community, not the tribal chiefs. Now, this is one component of the issue, but then the relationship between the hakims themselves and the tribal elites, that really requires more historical research here, okay? What I see from my particular research is that from around the 16th century until the late 18th century, the hakim maintains his political and economic authority with respect to the tribes in and around Palu, which I describe as the greater Palu area. But coming to the 19th century, once the Ottoman state factors in, and they appoint the hakim as the officially appointed tax collector, that's when the hakim loses his authority with respect to tribal chiefs. And then that former, established conduct disappears. And it now is a more conflictual relationship between the hakim and the tribal chiefs. I don't know, for the moment, I hope that kind of, okay. But of course, it's like a much bigger question in terms of like the time periods and also in terms of the specific regions, because the Sarhat region, it's different. Things are a little different because Sarhat maintains its border position for a much longer time period than the area that I am working on.
Thank you, Professor Nilay. I hope that was a satisfactory answer for Ner. And now I'm going to give the mic to Rezan. Rezan, go ahead and please ask your question.
Hi everyone. It was a great presentation. Thank you so much. It's always great to hear your presentation.
Thank you.
And so my question will be actually also regarding to some research that you have made about the archives. We know the archives is only coming from one side. And the one side that we have been seeing through the Turkish authors, which is Yavuz Bahaduroğlu and other authors, we only see some like romantic way of looking at this, that the Idris Tbilisi and like other tribes, they joined together and voluntarily they presented their loyalty to Ottoman Empire. So we just like see that all the time in all the writings. So my question will be, during your research, did you find anything that is opposed that idea, which we know that like geographically we know that Idris Tbilisi and like the even Sharafname, like we see that they are more closer to Safavids geographically. So like what was the tension between them during the time that they decided, or did they decide to work with the Ottoman Empire at the time?
You're absolutely right. I mean, that is like Yavuz Bahaduroğlu is a good example here, like a popular account of a moment that is really critical for understanding Kurdish history. It is romanticized, but it's also because like it is the zeitgeist of 2010s where there's a search for like an Islamic unity. We got this. Kurds are Muslim, and then we established this together. So there's like a political context to that narrative. Having said that, yes, when we look at the Kurdish elite groups and their alliances, there is nothing kind of like a linear or nothing that guarantees the Kurdish elite groups' loyalty towards the Ottomans. To the contrary, we see that there is a lot of back and forth. Their loyalty is not fixed in time. Even after several decades, we see that there are Kurdish elite groups that lean more towards the Safavid side than the Ottomans. So that historical narrative is definitely wrong. And you're right in pointing out the fact that alliances were more fluid. Alliances were definitely more fluid. And that's why groups like the Palubegs, they stand out, because from early on, there is an historical narrative about their loyalty, how they, chose the Ottoman side. And there is also like a sectarian kind of like a twist to the narrative, because most of the Kurdish groups were Sunni, they kind of opted for Ottomans. None of this is kind of accurate, because these are all coming from our nation state perspective. From our nation state understanding that groups operated on the basis of their assumed ideal type identity, and they just chose the Ottomans because they were loyal, or they chose the Ottomans because the Safavids were more oppressive. All of these have a certain kernel of truth when we look at specific elite groups. Yes, at some point we see that they lean towards the Ottomans because there was like the discourse, the newly emerging discourse of religious identity in the Ottoman side was working. But in others, it was simply territorial, right? They maintained their territory, and they, in fact, expanded it during the Safavid-Ottoman wars. And then Ottoman recognition kind of gave them a certain degree of motivation to collaborate with the Ottomans. So there are tons of examples here from specific elite groups, specific context and examples. That is simply like an ideal type narrative that comes from our nation state sensibilities. I mean, even in the 19th century, we see that several Kurdish elite groups in the Serhat area, they have closer relationship with the Iranian elites than they had with the Ottomans. They had their correspondence in Persian with them. This long process of conquest in the mid-19th century, they saw the Iranian part more of as an ally than the Ottomans. So that narrative is definitely not accurate. It is a simplification. And several episodes of Kurdish-Ottoman interactions and Kurdish-Iranian interactions indicate that.
Thank you, Professor Nilay. There is another question in the chat. I'm going to read that for you. Şener Özmen is asking, with the emergence of the modern Kurdish armed organizations, I'm very curious about the situation of the Kurdish nobility in this process. Do you have any work on this subject?
Thank you, Şener, for the question. Of modern Kurdish armed organizations,
that might need a clarity, but we can ask him if he wants to take the mic.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm not very clear about that question. Müsteşar.
ببرن دنگی متى
Evet.
ha Nilay yani من داور گراندن belki yani tam ne kedibeceği bu mugot yani de devren nude de demen nude yani registinin modern en lujen en kurda gava derketin ev malbaten torin en kuhvadi asalet kwadi yani naha emkarın بأواي كي قالوان بكن كو çi tekiliya wan peyvendiya wan be organizasyon be rakistinin kurda en modern ve çebiye yani çine biye taybeti te tişteki usa te lekonike usa kiriye yanına yani modern Kürt örgütlerinin ortaya çıkışından sonra Kürt asilleri diyebileceğimiz asillerin yani bu hareketlerle olan bağlarını artık konuşabiliyor muyuz? Bunun üzerine özellikle bir çalışmanız oldu mu diye merak ettim ben.
Yani konuşamıyoruz. Şöyle konuşamıyoruz. Gene Palu örneğini ele alalım. Şöyle ki, mesela Palu çok aslında yani güzel bir örnek. Bunun üzerine kafa yorabilmek
Nilay,
için.
can we proceed in English, please?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Ben Türkçe konuş. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that I switched languages. I'm so sorry. Okay. Palu is a great example to talk about this, how this notion of nobility and the position of the noble families change when the Kurdish political organizations are changing in a modern nation state building context. Is that right? Am I understanding it wrong? So that's what I was saying. Palu is a great example here because in Palu, we have two narratives, right? Two historical narratives. One is about Sheikh Said rebellion, right? Because this is where we see this movement being influential and the origins of the rebellion and so on and so forth. And the other one is about the Kurdish nobles, right? The Kurdish noble base. But these histories never converge. Now, we know that when the modern state or modernization took place among the Kurdish elite groups, there was this kind of like hesitancy among particular elites. Palu elites are one of them. They turned their faces more towards the state than the later emerging nationalist organizations of the Kurds. So one key question here is, what was the position of the Palu elites within the Sheikh Said context, which we know is that they did not really support it. And there are also evidence that they worked with the state against the Sheikh Said rebellions, so rebels. Now, there is that. But the second thing is modern Kurdish armed organizations, we can bring it like, I don't know, we can take it from the 1920s to the 1930s, to the Azadi, even to the contemporary era. But then we will have to look at specific elite groups because, like, for instance, Bedirhan's family, they also claim to have a noble status, which is not equally proven by the state, by the way, compared to the Palu nobles. Theirs is like a symbol of Kurdish nationalism, right? In various episodes of Kurdish history, they are the flag bearers of Kurdish nationalism. Whereas other groups, like in Palu, like in Eil, they tend to be more representing the kind of quote-unquote conservative face of Kurdish politics, allying with the state, allying first with the Ottoman state and later with the Turkish state. So there's a lot of tense historical narratives going on here that makes it really imperative to look at specific cases and specific examples. But bringing it down to my specific elite family, they never had any intention to be a part of an Kurdish nationalist organization or supporting any type of image or ideal of Kurdistan.
Thank you, Professor Nilay, and thank you, Şener.
Thank you.
I hope the question and the answer, neither of these got lost in translation.
No, it shouldn't. Yeah, there is one more question. Thank you, Mr. Şener. There is another question and suggestions. I think that's Zalfa.
Yeah, that's from me.
From the number. Okay, cool. So it says, have you thought about researching the hierarchy of titles in the Kurdish powerful structure in relation to the Ottomans?
No, I did not, because what I encountered in my research was that there are several titles that come from the Kurdish reality or Kurdish or hierarchies within the Kurdish society that find resonance in Ottoman administrative system. Meaning, I mean, going back to Mujahid's original question, for instance, Hakim, that position does not exist in the Ottoman system in other places. That's unique to the Kurdish political formations. And that finds resonance in Ottoman records, right? Then that becomes a part of the Ottoman policymaking because they want to make sure that they pick a loyal Hakim. But there is a lot of work done recently about tribes and Ottoman administration of tribes specifically, and how Ottomans actually construct the idea of the tribe and the institution of the tribes in ways that might or might not resemble the actual ways in which tribes existed in Kurdistan or other parts of the empire. I guess what I'm saying here is that tribe itself or the hierarchies within them or other hierarchies within the Kurdish society, they're not static. They are changing in a dynamic, in a fluid way as they interact with the Ottoman society. But those titles specifically that you mentioned, they do find resonance in Ottoman administrative system, but it's not something that I am specifically interested in doing because I'm more interested in understanding the political economy of elite formation in Kurdistan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nilay and Zafa, for the question.
Is there a room for another question?
Yeah, of course, please go ahead. As long as it's brief and
very brief. The reason I brought this question because I noticed that you're using tribes. In fact, in Syria, we never use tribes for Kurdish people, even for nobility or to describe any structure in among the Kurdish people. We say ashair. Tribes make us think of the Bedouins in the Gulf area, of the Bedouins among the Arabs. But in Syria, we never refer as Kurdish people. We never say qaba'il. It means tribes. We say ashair. Ashair, it means a gathering. It's a gathering that has a structure, that has leadership. But it's never the same as a tribe.
Well, I mean, the discussion about translation of these specific terms is an important one. I definitely agree with you. But what you understand from tribe, or whether it is Qabail or Ashair or others in our contemporary era, that's what exactly I was saying in response to the your previous question. What we mean by them now or in the 20th century does not necessarily mean that they were used in similar ways in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So yes, Ashair came to have connotations that have, you know, essentialist implications because of the modernization from 19th century onwards, right? Tribes came to be, Ashair came to be associated with backwardness, primitiveness, a pastoralist lifestyle, and all of that. But that transition happened in the 19th century with modernity. Prior to that, of course, Ottomans used Ashair as well. They didn't use tribe. They actually used the phrase Ekrad and Ashair. They both came together to talk about Kurds. But then we know that in different parts of the empire, Ashair gained a very pejorative meaning with the modernization. So, but I really need to, this is an important question, what terms we use and what is their implications. But I really need to emphasize the fact that our notions of the 20th century do not necessarily resonate with the 16th, 17th century sensibilities.
Thank you so much. We need more of you. Please, Data Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zafa, and thank you, Professor Nilay, for responding to all the questions. I think I don't see any other questions in the chat, or I don't see any raised hand. I think we are fine now. Professor Nilay, I thank you very much for this wonderful, great, informative presentation. And thank you for all the audience for listening and being engaged in the talk and the discussion. This was the final event of our Spring Series, Spring Speaker Series in 2024, and we will have a lot more speakers coming in the fall and the following spring in 2025. Please be, please stay tuned for the announcements for that. We'll be publishing soon for the next speakers. And we will have a in-person event in Chicago this Saturday. I'm just gonna drive to the flyer here. Professor Bilici will be sharing my screen here quick. So we'll have an in-person lecture, which here I'm having trouble with tech here. So this Saturday we will have basically an inaugural lecture for our critical Muslim studies, our master's program in critical Muslim studies, which will be launched in the fall. So this is kind of like an inaugural launch event for our master's program. And Professor Mücahit Bilici will be presenting on post-Islamism and the flight from religion, Turkey's new secularization. So if you are in the Chicago area, please join us for this in-person event. If not, you can share with the people you know in the Chicago area. Again, I thank you, Professor Nilay, for presenting today, and all the audience for joining. I hope you have a very nice day. See you soon in the next event. Have a good day.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the questions and comments.
Thank you.